In the music industry, there's many musicians that have discographies with more than a few great albums on them. David Bowie, Bob Dylan, Paul Simon, Neil Young, Tom Petty, and the list goes on. But there's only a few among those that have been consistently releasing albums for more than 5 decades. Whether we're talking about his solo discography or his work with the Beatles, it's undeniable that no matter where you look, you won't find another Paul McCartney.
Well, I just can't get enough of that sweet stuff my little lady gets behind.
I've been enjoying this man's music for as long as I can remember. Actually, I'm pretty sure that if you go and watch every single video I've uploaded to the channel, most of them, a vast majority of them, are going to be about Paul and his work with the Beatles, because I really do love the man's music that much. From the studio albums, to the live albums, to his classical music albums, to the soundtracks, to the compilations, to his work with the Firemen, I've ingested every ounce of music this man has put out. And that's the reason why I wanted to make a video celebrating his discography, and what better way to do that than going back to every single one of his albums and ranking all of them from worst to best. We're talking about more than 25 albums, and even more than 30 if you want to count his work with the Firemen. So, to make this video as cohesive as possible and to give the list a certain continuity, I think it's best if we only stick to his solo albums and his work with Wings. That means no soundtrack albums, no covers albums, and no Firemen albums. I know that a lot of you are going to be quite annoyed by this, and I understand, but I think we can also agree that when it comes to Paul McCartney, his work with the Firemen is very different from anything he ever did on his solo discography. And when it comes to the covers albums, I mean, Paul McCartney is praised and acclaimed for his incredible songwriting ability, so covers, I don't really think they're that meaningful to his discography. So I think we can skip those and make the video tighter and more cohesive, overall a better video. Even removing those albums out of the way, we still have 22 albums to go through, so this is going to be a long video. Make sure you have a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, and something to eat, because we're in for the long run. I do want to remind you though, this is only my own personal opinion. The only metric that we're going to be using for this video is how much I enjoy the album. Obviously, I'm going to try and explain my reasoning why I think number 1 is better than number 2, but even then, I think we're going to disagree quite a lot, so leave me your own list down below so we can all see it and have a conversation about your list in the comments section. I don't really want to make this intro too long, so let's just go on with number 22.
More of your songs on here, ukulele, you know.
Even though Press to Play, released in 1986, is at number 22, I don't want you to think this is a bad album. If you enjoy Paul McCartney's music, I'm pretty sure that you're going to like quite a few of the songs in this one, especially the intro, Stranglehold, or maybe the ballad Only Love Remains. There's quite a few rhythmic dance pop tunes in here that are going to be quite enjoyable if you liked albums like McCartney II and some of the songs in Flowers in the Dirt, for example. Even more if you enjoyed albums like Pipes of Peace. There's a lot to like in this album. The problem is that this is by far Paul McCartney's most unfocused album. Actually, a lot of the production decisions in this album sound really similar to those featured in Flowers in the Dirt, an album that I like quite a lot and you'll probably see really high on this list. The problem with this album, and the reason why in my opinion is one of his worst, is because of the terrible lack of identity that plagues this entire album. One of the most noticeable and obvious examples would be the song Pretty Little Head that sounds like a crappy version of a Talking Heads song. Footprints, Move Over Busker, Angry barely even sound like McCartney songs, and I understand it's the 80s. A lot of artists from the 60s and the 70s found it kind of hard to adapt to the new era of music. I understand, but that doesn't really mean that you get to release an album with such little levels of commitment as Press to Play, and I think that that's one of the main reasons why I really don't enjoy a lot of the songs featured on this album. And once again, I'm not really saying that the songs are bad. Some of these songs have these dance rhythms that are really catchy, and there's a few songs that I do like Only Love Remains and Stranglehold, but for the most part I think this is the most forgettable and inconsequential album that Paul McCartney ever released, which is the reason why I put it at number 22. You know, even though I'm putting it at number 21, I have a lot of love for Egypt Station. After New, I didn't really know if McCartney was ever going to release an album again, so when this album was announced and the fact that I loved the singles so much, like I Don't Know and Come On To Me, made me feel like this was going to be an incredible album. Unfortunately, I was wrong. First of all, it was It's marketed as a concept album, but it isn't. Actually, it's not even close. Then you also have the fact that it holds some of the most horrible songs that Paul McCartney ever released, like Foo You, or however you're supposed to say that, and People Want Peace, one of the corniest songs that Paul McCartney ever wrote, and believe me, that's saying a lot. The rock and roll tunes like Energy, the instrumentation, percussion feels flat, uninspiring. There's a lot of things I don't like about this album. Actually, I was really close to placing it last in this list, but in my opinion, this album is a bit more focused and a bit more cohesive than Press to Play, so that's the reason why I put it a little higher. But this album is definitely the one I enjoy the least, especially since this was released after New, which is an album that showed that even though McCartney is old, he can still put up a show, so I don't really understand why there's such a massive lack of energy in almost every single performance. There's exceptions like the ones I said at the very beginning, Come On To Me and I Don't Know. There's also Who Cares and Back in Brazil, songs that I like quite a lot, but for the most part there's a lot of loose ideas and underwhelming performances all throughout this album. And I think that the fact that this album goes on for almost an hour make me question what the critics were thinking when they gave this album such a high score. Let's move on to number 20. We have 2001's A Driving Rain. Now I know that there's going to be quite a few people really upset that this album is so low on the list, but hear me out. I know that there's quite a few great songs in this one: Lonely Road, From a Lover to a Friend, the title track Driving Rain, but I also feel like this is one of the most underwhelming albums in Paul McCartney's discography. With this album, Paul McCartney was continuing the trend that he set on Flaming Pie in 1997, adding a little bit more storytelling to his songwriting and also making the whole atmosphere of the album way darker for Paul McCartney standards. It resulted in an incredible album with Flaming Pie, so clearly using the same formula again would also make Driving Rain a great album. The problem is that this time around, he added some heavier rock elements and pop sounds that kind of don't mix very well with the serious tone of an album like Flaming Pie. I know that comparing one album to another is not exactly the best way to approach a review, but it's really difficult not to when it's so painfully obvious that he used the exact same formula to write the songs in this album, but it didn't really work as well as it did with Flaming Pie. Once again, you do have some incredible moments in this album, like the song Spinning on an Axis having one of the most beautiful introductions to a Paul McCartney song ever, the intimate and personal nature of the song From a Lover to a Friend, the incredibly catchy Lonely Road, and the more pop-oriented Magic. There's a lot of things to like here, but this album goes on for over an hour, and it simply doesn't have the quality inside it to make the whole hour entertaining. But this is way better than the two previous albums we covered, and starting from this point, I believe that every single album here is more than solid, so the fact that I'm putting it at number 20 doesn't really mean that I don't like the album or that I don't revisit the album every now and then. So yeah, number 20. At number 19, we have the 1983 album Paths of Peace, released right after the incredibly successful and acclaimed Tug of War. This album is incredibly confusing to me because it has some songs that I really do enjoy quite a lot, but overall I feel like a lot of the focus that was put in this album was more towards the instrumentation rather than the melodies and the performance, because it feels like Paul McCartney was sacrificing a lot of his integrity as an artist to fit in with whatever was happening in the 80s and to sound more similar to those artists, including the likes of Michael Jackson, which is the reason why, unlike Tug of War, a lot of the compositions in here are quite rhythmic, none of them are too personal, none of them are anything close to acoustic, and I think that that's one of the main reasons why this album is not really that enjoyable. For me, the main catch in a Paul McCartney song is always going to be the melodies, his ability to sing the melodies and to come up with these melodies and to come up with the proper instrumentation for the melodies, but everything revolves around the melodies. So when you make an album that seems to focus more on instrumentation and to make it catchy, like a lot of the things that Michael Jackson was doing in albums like Thriller and Off the Wall, I think that you lose a lot of what makes you Paul McCartney, and that's kind of like the main issue with this one. But even if I don't really support this idea of sacrificing melody for rhythm, I still think the album is super entertaining. I'm never bored listening to it, and me saying that most of the album focuses on rhythm doesn't really really mean that you don't have your typical melodic Paul McCartney moments like the title track, like the song The Man with Michael Jackson, or the final song in this album, Through Our Love. So yeah, not a bad album at all. I think that McCartney was a little lost in the 80s, didn't really know what to do, and since he was in this weird partnership with Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson was doing, what we saw in Thriller, I think that he tried to do something similar and it didn't work. But, he tried, and the attempt is, it's appreciated. Let's move on with number 18. We have Off the Ground, released in 1993, a weird album inside of McCartney's discography. It's one of those unique instances in which McCartney went into the writing and recording of an album without a proper plan, without knowing the genre he wanted to use, without knowing the instrumental palette he was going to employ for the writing and recording of a lot of these songs, and I think that the result is probably one of the most bloated albums of his entire discography. There's a variety of performance and writing styles throughout this whole thing that make the album suffer a little bit because it's not cohesive, but it keeps the album interesting and entertaining and makes it feel unique. You have the rhythmic guitar playing in Hope of Deliverance, which in my opinion is one of the best post-70s McCartney singles. Then you also have the echoed drums in Mistress and Maid with that incredibly catchy melody. Golden Earth Girl is one of the best McCartney ballads in the 90s, and you have some of his best rockers as well with Looking for a Change and Get Out of My Way. There's a lot of things to like about this album. I'm actually kind of surprised that I put it so low on the list now that I think about it, but I think that the main reason why I'm not going to put it any higher is because a lot of the ideas that Paul McCartney used for this album were scratched in the next one, Flaming Pie, and I think that makes the album lose a lot of meaning inside his discography, which I think it's why I put it so low, but for the most part, this album has some incredible songs in it, really catchy, really enjoyable, nothing too great, but enough to make this album a good listen. One of the most amazing things about Paul McCartney is that unlike a lot of artists that have been around for as long as he has, he's constantly trying to find something new to do. He doesn't want to do the same album over and over again. So after he released an incredibly successful album with Memory Almost Full, one would think that 6 years later he's going to try to do the same thing because it worked. He's an old man. He doesn't really have the versatility he had back then, so probably he's going to try and do a similar album. But that's not the case at all. And the title of this album is incredibly fitting because this album truly feels like the beginning of a new era for Paul McCartney. At this point, it's more than obvious that McCartney doesn't really have his voice anymore. Those raspy vocals and tenor quality vocals that he used to pull back in the 70s, the 80s, and even the 90s in albums like Flaming Pie are not there anymore. So that means that most of the songs in this album don't really have the same levels of energy. That's not the case at all because the intro song in this album, Save Us, is one of the most energetic and euphoric songs that Paul McCartney has ever released. Instead of using his own voice, since he can't anymore, he uses harmonies, backing vocals, and very well put together instrumentation to accentuate certain parts of the song, and it works really well. It also features moments where McCartney embraces the 2010s by using synths and electronic sounds on songs like Queenie Eye and the title track New. You have your typical acoustic rock songs where Paul McCartney relies heavy on melody, and it works well for the most part. You also have that amazing Beatles tribute in the song Early Days. I really do enjoy a vast majority of the songs in this album, and I do like Paul McCartney's enthusiasm, the way it filters through the music, but the problem here is that the album feels like a bit of a mess. There's quite a few producers working on this album. I think Gils Martin is on here, Paul Epworth, Ethan Johns, Mark Ronson, there's a bunch of people working in the production here, and I think that, I don't have any evidence of course, but I think that that's part of the reason why the songs feel so alienated from each other. It feels more like a compilation rather than an actual album, and that takes a few points away. There's also the fact that a lot of times the production makes McCartney's voice sound dry and kind of like tired when he's putting quite a lot of energy into this track, so you can feel it. It's hard to explain. It's better for you to listen to the album, and I'm pretty sure you'll notice what I'm talking about, but for the most part, it's a really good late era Paul McCartney album, and the only reason why it's not higher is because of how messy it is and because of the questionable production decisions. Alright guys, so as you can see, we have a bit of a wardrobe change because I had to go to work. So we're continuing this video the next day, but we're continuing with number 16, the first entry on this list of the McCartney trilogy, McCartney III, released in 2020. I was super excited when this album was announced because, as I said before, Egypt Station was a massive disappointment, so this was another opportunity for McCartney to prove that he was an amazing artist, and he didn't disappoint. There's a lot of solid songs in this album, there's a lot of variety, the instrumental palette ballad is all over the place. You can tell that McCartney's a way better producer than what he was in McCartney II and 1 because the production in this album is pristine. From the sharp drums and precise piano playing in Find My Way, all the way up to the incredible guitar playing of Liberty Lil, to the intimate nature of McCartney's performance in The Case of Venus. You have some heavy songs in here too, like the intro and Sliding, you know. You have some of the best late era McCartney songs in this album, but you also have some songs that are kind of questionable, like Women and Wives, which has to be one of my least favorite tracks, and then Deep Deep Feeling, Deep Down, even though I like the instrumentation and the whole groove of the song. I believe that the lyrics are so repetitive and pointless that, you know, the song kind of loses a lot of its purpose. So even though I really enjoyed McCartney III, I hope that in the next album he focuses a little bit more on rekindling that old flame instead of trying to do something new, because I think that will result in a great album. Alright, so at number 15 we have the first Wings album we'll be talking about in this video, and that is Wildlife, released in 1971. I don't understand why people hate this album so much. I have to be honest, I enjoy a vast majority of the songs in this album, and the ones that I don't enjoy is because they're not even songs, like Mumbo, Bebop, Bebop Ling, Mumbo Ling, you know, but the rest of the songs, the ones that are actually finished, in my opinion, are among the best songs that Wings ever released. I do get the feeling, you know, that this feels more like a pilot album rather than a proper release. I definitely do agree with that argument, but that doesn't really mean that you can't enjoy the actual finished parts of the album, like Tomorrow, like Wildlife, you know, one of the best vocal performances by Paul McCartney ever, Love is Strange, Some People Never Know, I Am Your Singer, you know, one of the only times that Linda McCartney performed a melodic song, because in other albums by Wings she was performing things like Cook of the House, songs that are not necessarily that bad, and we'll get to it once we're talking about those albums, but this is one of the only times that she was singing a love song basically, and I really enjoy it. We obviously can't forget the alleged apology to John Lennon, Dear Friend, one of the most beautiful and vulnerable ballads by Paul McCartney. There's a lot of things to like about this album. I really don't understand where all the hate comes from. Actually, even some of the unfinished leftover songs in this album are kind of interesting, like the Mumbo song, you know, with some of the best Paul McCartney vocals ever. You also have those echoed hypnotizing guitars and Bebop Ling that are kind of interesting. There's a lot to like in this album, and I personally think that people hate it a little bit too much because of how unfinished it is, because there's a lot of loose ideas. There's not a lot of layering in the instrumentation. The production is really rough, especially in songs like Tomorrow and Some People Never Know, and I do agree that, you know, at times the album is a little boring. You know, it feels very organic, like a band jamming in the studio, but I think that's part of the magic of this album, and I think that if you're reading this album as a serious release by Wings, that's kind of your problem, you know. Even then, I don't think this is one of the best releases by the band at all. I think that Wings went on to release more cohesive and well put together albums. That's the reason why it's at number 15, you know, it's not high on the list. But saying that this album is the worst release by Paul McCartney ever, I think it's a huge exaggeration, and that's the reason why I'm putting it at number 15. While on the topic of well put together albums, let's go to 1978's London Town, another release by Wings. Actually, this is the lineup that gave us Band on the Run, so this album had a lot of potential. Unfortunately, the album overstays its welcome with songs like Cufflink, Children Children, I've Had Enough, Famous Groupies, you know, such a silly song that it didn't need to be in an album like this that has so many catchy tunes, like the title track London Town, like Coffee on the Left Bank. I love that song so much. The super intimate and romantic I'm Carrying, one of my favorite performances by Paul McCartney when it comes to this acoustic songs that he liked to do in each of the Wings albums. You also have one of the most recognizable songs that Paul McCartney ever released, With a Little Luck, with its catchy melody, cute performance, and charming and adorable lyrics. This is one of my favorite songs in this album, but not my favorite because they also have Girlfriend in this album, given to Michael Jackson for his album Off the Wall. I like Michael Jackson's version a little bit more, but Wings' version is also really good, incredibly catchy. I love the guitar playing. I love the how, you know, Paul McCartney uses his falsetto instead of his chest voice for the song. A lot of things to like in this album. I think that if it weren't for all the filler tracks, if it weren't for the second half basically, I would like this album a lot more and it would be way higher. And I know that people that actually enjoy those songs that in my opinion are filler consider this to be among the greatest Paul McCartney McCartney albums ever, and I definitely understand why. It has the potential to be that. And something really similar happens with number 13, Wings at the Speed of Sound, released in 1976, because this album has some of my favorite songs by the band, like Silly Love Songs, Let 'Em In, She's My Baby, but then there's also the rest of the album. This album gave the band a lot of freedom. Critics back in the day were saying that Wings was only a vehicle for McCartney to continue with his solo career, and Paul McCartney wanted to prove them wrong, which is the reason why even songs that he himself wrote, he gave to other members of the band to perform, like the incredible The Note You Never Wrote. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Denny didn't really do a good job with the song. I think he did a wonderful job, actually, but I think we can all agree that if performed by McCartney, the song would have had a lot more power, intensity, and passion overall. Then you have Cook of the House, which I know that is a track that's supposed to support the idea of this being a concept album, a Day with the McCartneys type of album, but I think that Linda is really underappreciated when it comes to, the songs that we're giving to her to perform. I don't like the song at all. I think it's really silly and goofy. I don't like the way that her voice is produced. I think that in songs like I Am Your Singer in Wildlife, she was able to perform with a more clean voice, and it sounds beautiful. You can see that also in albums like Ram and, songs like Hey Diddle, for example, where it's made obvious that the cleaner Linda's voice is, the more beautiful her performance is going to be. So I really don't understand why they give her this song. But when it comes to Paul, you really do have some of his best songs in this album, like Let Him In, for example, with that marching band-like percussion. You have the groovy dance tune She's My Baby, and then obviously the timeless classic Silly Love Songs. There's a few other songs in here that are solid, like Send Fairy Ann and Warm and Beautiful. Even though that ballad is kind of stale, it doesn't really go anywhere. I believe that Paul McCartney's performance and that beautiful melody is more than enough to make a good song. Giving the band so much freedom to perform so many of these tracks, I think, was a mistake, because the main catch in a Paul McCartney album is always going to be Paul McCartney, so given the fact that almost half of the songs in here are not Paul McCartney, I think, bring this album down to number 13. What an incredible album we have at number 12, A Memory Almost Full, released in 2007. For me, this is the birth of the late era McCartney albums, even though Chaos and Creation in the Backyard was released only 2 years prior in 2005, I believe. I think that in those albums, he was still bringing along that energy that he created with Flaming Pie. Instead, in this album, he developed a whole different style, and it's pretty obvious from the first song in this album, Dance Tonight, this ukulele dance tune that is so adorable and so charming. Is so, it feels so good seeing a old Paul McCartney having so much fun making new music, and I think that's the reason why this is such a special album in my opinion. I do believe that some of the songs in this album produced Paul McCartney's voice in a way that it sounds dry and it sounds really worn out, something similar to what happened in the album New. I don't really know what the producer, who I think was David Kane or David Kahn, I don't really know how to say his name, I'm sorry, but I don't really know what he was thinking when he was producing McCartney's voice. Everything else sounds incredible. The production in this album is pristine when it comes to the instrumentation, the volume of the synths that are featured on this album, low enough to give enough protagonism to McCartney, but high enough to replace the energy that he used to put into his songs with his voice and his performance. I believe that McCartney embraces the new era of music quite well with this album, and even though you can already tell that his voice is losing a lot of its edge, like it happened in Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, he still tries to do some powerful power chord ballads in here, like You Tell Me and House of Wax. It doesn't really work that well, because once again, that voice doesn't really have that power that characterized some of his ballads from the 70s and the 80s, but he tries, and I appreciate the attempt. I definitely understand and sympathize with anyone who says that I'm crazy for putting this album above things like Wings at the Speed of Sound and London Town, because once again, the production, the instrumentation, the performances in those albums are way better. But I think that this album is not only, the sum of its parts, but a testament of McCartney's determination to create music and to keep doing new things. Songs like Ever Present Past, Vintage Clothes, and Only Mama Knows are some of my favorite Paul McCartney songs ever, so I think that you can appreciate this album a lot more when you've heard the entirety of the man's discography and understand how much of a turning point this album was. So yeah, that's the reason why I put it above those albums, and it's the reason why it's staying at number 12, even though it's a little more underwhelming than a lot of the albums that I put beneath it. At number 11, almost making it to the top 10, we have the 1980 McCartney II album, the second entry of the McCartney trilogy. I know that a lot of you are going to be quite outraged because I put this album so high on the list, and a lot of you are going to say that it's not high enough because this is one of the most confusing albums of McCartney's discography. A lot of people believe it's a masterpiece. A lot of people love the fact that he was so eager to embrace the 80s and all the synths and electronic sounds. But some others think that McCartney's embracement of the new era was too forced, and he ended up creating some of his worst songs, and I agree with both. Coming up has to be one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Paul McCartney song ever. I love the dance groove of the song, I love the bass line, I love Paul McCartney's performance, I love the strings and the synths, how they kind of battle each other in the background, representing, in my opinion, the side of McCartney that wants to stay in the classic era of music, and the side that wants to embrace the new era as well. You know, it's a beautiful representation of the conflict that this album represents, and that is one of the main reasons why this track is such a masterpiece in my opinion, and very, very overlooked by a lot of the fans. I know that for a lot of you, Temporary Secretary is a banger, it's a great song, but not for me. I think it's annoying. I think that, you know, the synths and the electronic sounds sound so out of pace and don't really follow a certain rhythm. I hate the metalish quality of the guitar playing in this song. I hate Paul McCartney's voice, how it's produced, so aggressively mixed. You know, there's a lot of things that I don't like about this song, which is the reason why it's one of the main reasons why this album didn't really make it to the top 10. On the Way has some incredible guitar playing and really nice tenor quality vocals by Paul McCartney, and Waterfalls is a bit of a stale ballad. You know, it doesn't really go anywhere. It's really slow, and it feels like it doesn't really follow any tempo or rhythm, and I don't really like that. One of the reasons why I love McCartney's ballads so much is because of how dynamic they are. Something's always happening. Instead, in Waterfalls, it feels like there's a lot of quiet moments, there's a lot of boring moments, and yeah, that's the reason why, even though I like the melody, and even though it's a moment that I don't really mind all that much in the album, I don't think it's among the best songs in the album. The rest of the album kind of fluctuates a lot in terms of quality. You have songs like Nobody Knows and Boogie Music that are fucking terrible, and then you also have Frozen Jap, Summer Day Song, Dark Room, One of These Days, songs that I really do enjoy quite a lot, especially Dark Room with those sharp synths that sound like they're just passing by. You know, a lot of great decisions made in terms of instrumentation in this album, and that is one of the main reasons why I feel like the album was so misunderstood. You know, people couldn't believe that McCartney was actually able to create some interesting new wave and synth pop music. You know, that's I feel like people weren't ready for this album, and now 44 years after it was released, we're able to appreciate the album for what it was, a really nice and solid new wave album that, you know, was ahead of its time. Alright, so we finally jump into the top 10 with one of the most wasted opportunities in the history of McCartney's discography, 1973's Red Rose Speedway. The reason why I say this is because, in my opinion, this album had the potential of being even better than Band on the Run, and I'm not exaggerating. You have songs like Hi Hi Hi, Little Woman Love, Mary Had a Little Lamb, The Mess, Come On, Live and Let Die, I Lie Around, Country Dreamer. All these songs were left off the album because the label didn't really want to release a double album. They didn't think it was good for sales. So we're left with only, you know, the one disc album we have available, with songs like Big Barn Red, My Love, Get on the Right Thing, songs that are really good and represents McCartney's talent as a melody maker. But I can't help but feel that this album was supposed to be way bigger, because it was. It was supposed to have so many more amazing songs. And actually, the original track list doesn't even have the best songs this album has to offer. Like the loop, First Indian on the Moon thing, is probably one of the worst moments in McCartney's discography. It's this weird instrumentation that doesn't really fall in line with any of the rest of the album's instrumental palette, so I don't really understand what it was included. Songs like One More Kiss are charming, you know, have a nice melody, and do kind of fall in place with a lot of what McCartney was doing in 1973, even in albums like Band on the Run. But when you compare that to songs like Little Lamb and Dragonfly, Single Pigeon, wonderful piano ballad, When the Night, songs where McCartney and the band put a lot of effort in the performance, in the instrumentation, and then you have One More Kiss. You know, it's a little underwhelming. You also have the medley at the very end of the album. I like the love songs, I like the romanticism of the medley, but in my opinion, it doesn't really feel like a medley. You know, it's just 4 love songs put together. The whole point of a medley is to drive you through a variety of sound, a range of genres, you know, like it happened in the Abbey Road medley. Instead of this one, and this one is just a love songs medley. What's the point? Just make 4 different songs. I know that I'm trashing the album quite a bit, which is weird because I put it in the top 10, but the reason why I'm doing this is is because, once again, the potential this album had was massive, with some of the greatest Paul McCartney songs with Wings, and it was left out just because the label didn't want it a double album. But even then, I don't really understand why the track list looks the way it looks now. I do love a lot of these songs. My Love is one of the best Paul McCartney ballads out there. I love Single Pigeon. I love his chemistry with his wife Linda in this track. You know, the way that she offers this beautiful, clean backing vocals. I love Little Lamb Dragonfly. I think it has some of his best tenor quality vocals that McCartney was known for in the 70s and some of the albums in the 80s. There's a lot of things to like about this album, and overall it's an amazing listen, but I think that this album could have been so much better. A top 5, maybe even top 3 album, and we don't really have that because the label didn't want us to have it. So yeah, that's the reason why it stays at number 10. Could have been way higher, but what do you do? Alright, so at number 9 we have what probably is the most controversial placement in this list, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, 2005, at number 9. I know that a lot of you probably want to kill me right now, but listen, I know that this album is super important. I know that this album features some of the most personal and intimate songs that Paul McCartney ever released, but in my opinion, this album is a little too melodramatic. It's a little too dark, a little too gloomy, and I acknowledge that he tried his best to fall in line with this gloomy atmosphere, but in my opinion, he didn't really pull it off. The songwriting is incredible. The intro Fine Line is one of my favorite Paul McCartney songs ever. How Kind of You offers a meditational moment in the album. Jenny Wren has this beautiful breathy vocals. It sounds like his voice is about to break, and that makes it sound really vulnerable. You also have the weirdly paced pianos of At the Mercy, making the song sound really dark. The sophistication and elegance of the string arrangements and the guitar playing of the song's English Tea, and a certain softness, the hypnotizing bells of Riding to Vanity Fair, which in my opinion is the best song in the album. There's a lot of things to like in this record. This is one of the best Paul McCartney albums out there, but McCartney sounds way out of place in an album that's so dark and so gloomy and so, I don't know, depressing, you know, and I feel like a lot of people appreciate this album because of that same depressive atmosphere it has. But for me, you know, analyzing his discography and noticing how even in his lowest moments he seems to tackle on these feelings with the most positive attitude and with uplifting music and with a lot of romanticism, seeing him do something like this feels a little weird. Plus his performance in songs like Follow Me, This Never Happened Before, or Promise You're a Girl feels a little, you know, his vocals feel a little strained, and that takes away a lot of the feeling from the track in my opinion. So yeah, even though I love this album, even though I think this is definitely a unique moment inside his discography, I think that the songwriting in here, the intimacy, and the overall sophistication of the songwriting in this album is amazing. I believe that Paul McCartney feels a little too out of place, and that's the reason why I put it at number 9. Great album, I love it, don't kill me. I understand that for a lot of you this album is really important, but in my opinion it's not really that big of a deal. Alright, so as you can see we have a brand new wardrobe change. I got called in for work again. This video is going to be so long, I can already tell, but we stay in high spirits because we go to number 8, 1997's Flaming Pie. Now, I like this album a lot. I think that it has a lot of the elements that made albums like Chaos and Creation in the Backyard really interesting and thought-provoking, like the dark atmosphere and the more storytelling reliant melodies. I think this is also a really important transitional moment for McCartney. For me, this is the moment where he realized that he wasn't able to perform as well as he used to in the 70s and the 80s, so he decided to change his approach to songwriting, now relying more on storytelling, as I said before, and using melodies that use falsetto a lot and don't really need to go that high in order to accentuate a certain part of the song. If you think that makes the album suffer, you know, because McCartney doesn't have the range that he used to have, you're wrong. You do have some of the most melodic and romantic songs that he ever wrote. It's a song we were singing, Calico Skies, Little Willow, Heaven on a Sunday, what a beautiful track. But you also have some really impressive rock and roll performances here, like the title track, Flaming Pie, one of my favorite rock and roll songs by Paul McCartney. I think the reason why this album was so successful in what it tried to do, you know, reinventing McCartney, was thanks to the help of Jeff Lynne and Steve Miller, who put a lot of work into this album. You have the wonderful production of George Martin, a couple songs in here too, and you have the help of Ringo Starr not only in the percussion, but also in terms terms of vocals in the song Really Love You. So I do think that this album goes on for a little too long. I don't think this album should have been almost an hour in length. Some songs in here like The World Tonight, If You Wanna, Really Love You didn't need to be more than 4 minutes long. You know, they kind of harm the enjoyability, the overall enjoyability of the album in my opinion, and it's the only reason why it's not higher on the list. You know, I don't usually listen to this album because of how slowly paced it is. But even then, I still believe that after the 80s, this is the best Paul McCartney album that you're going to find, and I believe it's one of the best releases from 1997, which was a really good year for music. So yeah, number 8. Moving on to number 7, we have the last album that the band Wings ever released, 1979's Back to the Egg. I have to be honest, I don't even know how this album made it so high up on the list. It doesn't deserve it. There's nothing really that special going on in this album, but I enjoy so much of the record. I mean, you have some of his best songs with Wings, Getting Closer, We're Open Tonight, Old Siam Sir, Arrow Through Me, which might be the song I've heard the most when it comes to Paul McCartney's solo discography. I love how funky and almost R&B-ish the song sounds, and I love Paul McCartney's raspy but also falsetto-ish performance. I do believe there's a little bit of filler in this album in the form of Spin It On, Winter Rose Love Awake. What a slow song. But for the vast majority of this album, you're going to have one great tune after another. What I meant at the beginning when I said that this album doesn't really deserve to be this high is that I placed quite a few albums beneath it that were way more important for Paul McCartney as a songwriter, like McCartney II, like Flaming Pie, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, Memory Almost Full, and I'm not really proud of that. But if I want to be honest with myself and I want to see this list and say, yes, number 7 is better than number 8 and number 9 and number 10, I have to put Back to the Egg so high up the list because I really do enjoy a vast majority of the songs in this album. Now, I don't really have a lot more to say about this album. I'd basically be saying the same thing I said about London Town, Wings at the Speed of Sound, and Rose Speedway, and I don't want this video to be that repetitive. For the most part, this is just a good collection of songs that features McCartney's versatility, adding rock and rollers like Getting Closer, dance tunes like Arrow Through Me, and the typical melodic McCartney moments in songs like Baby's Request, really nice jazz tunes, and Million Miles. So yeah, really good album, number 7. Now, I have to be honest, I wasn't really the biggest fan of number 6. I don't know if I was distracted by the horrible album cover or the wild variety of genres that Paul McCartney featured in this album, but I wasn't the biggest fan of Tug of War, released in 1982. But now I enjoy the album so much that putting it at number 6, quite high in a list with 22 albums, I feel like it's still too low. Every single song in this album is remarkably unique, not only inside of the album's sound palette, but in McCartney's entire discography. You have the wonderful intro, the powerful Tug of War, the adorable and catchy sound of Take It Away with those bass lines that fill the song with this groove and rhythm, that make it so entertaining. The elegance of the guitar playing and the percussion of the song Somebody Who Cares with McCartney's thought-provoking performance that, even though it doesn't really feature some of his best lyrics, actually a few of them are kind of stupid, I still think that songs like this and Get It, for example, add this melodic and carefree moments in the album that are quite refreshing compared to all the experimentation and layering that the rest of the instrumentation in this album has. You have the emotional and tear-jerking performance that Paul McCartney delivers in the beautiful John Lennon tribute Here Today, one of my favorite moments in the album and actually one of my favorite moments in his entire discography. However, there are a few moments in this album where McCartney falls victim to the 80s. One of the most obvious examples would be What's That You're Doing with Stevie Wonder, a song that on paper sounds incredible. I mean, Stevie Wonder and Paul McCartney, two of the greatest songwriters of all time, making a song together, it's probably amazing. Well, no, it's actually one of the most annoying songs of Paul McCartney's entire solo discography. And then you have that syrupy and mediocre ballad, Ebony and Ivory, that's supposed to have a political message in it. A powerful message, but the message itself is delivered in such a simplistic way that it loses a lot of its power, leaving just the mediocre ballad behind. But if you're able to ignore those, you're left with some of the best songs that Paul McCartney wrote in the 80s, like The Pound is Sinking, the powerful ballad Wanderlust, and of course, how can I forget the heavy piano playing in the song Ballroom Dancing, another one of my favorites in this album. Overall, I think the reason why I like this album so much is because this actually feels like a Paul McCartney album in the 80s. He's not trying too hard, definitely not as hard as albums like Pipes of Peace and Press to Play. There's multiple moments in in this album where he feels like the same McCartney that was releasing songs with the Beatles and songs with Wings, but there's also a bunch of moments of embracement of the new era, even more than, an album like McCartney II. He doesn't seem to be preoccupied with the way the people are going to perceive this album. He's just trying to find new ways to use his songwriting ability to make entertaining and catchy songs, and the result is one of the best albums from 1982, and an album that I think belongs in the Hall of Fame of Paul McCartney's solo discography. Number 5 is really special for me because, believe it or not, for about 5 or 4 years, this was my favorite release by Paul McCartney, and I believe that this album was on pair with albums like Abbey Road and Revolver. Obviously, I don't think that now. I still think it's a great album, but I used to love Venus and Mars to death. I used to love it so much that I remember being like 15 or 16 years old and recording myself singing every single song in this album, and I had lots of fun because, let me tell you, if I had to describe this album with just one word, it would be fun. It would be joy. It would be entertaining, from the opening song, the title track, all the way up to the Rock Show, which is probably my favorite rock and roll song by Paul McCartney ever, along with Flaming Pie probably. And then you go to what probably is the best first half in a McCartney album ever. Love in Song, his performance in that track is so incredible, so good. You go to You Gave Me the Answer, that typical music hall sound that McCartney liked to use in every single album. Magneto and Titanium Man, such an enjoyable and playful song, incredible performance as well. I believe that you have some of the most impressive vocal performances by Paul McCartney in here, with that raspy quality to his voice, that texture. Letting Go is also an incredible song. I love the guitar playing and I love McCartney's performance once again. And then you jump into the Reprise, which opens up the second half of the album, in my opinion the weaker half, and the reason why this isn't really any higher up the list. I love the fact that McCartney gave the opportunity to some of the other band members to not only perform songs but also write them. I think it was really nice of him, and makes Wings feels like an actual band, not just Paul McCartney and Wings. Unfortunately, much like it happened in Wings at the Speed of Sound, their compositions, Jamie's compositions, are not on par with McCartney's, and that creates a huge imbalance in the quality of this album. Spirits of Ancient Egypt and Medicine Jar are way weaker than any of the Paul McCartney songs in this album, so they feel like intruders. It feels like it disrupts the pace of this album. That is the reason why this album is as slow as number 5, even though I love it so much, because I have to say, Call Me Back Again, Listen to What the Man Said, You Gave Me the Answer, Rock Show, Magneto and Titanium Man are some of my favorite Paul McCartney songs ever, and I would love to put this album closer to number 1, maybe even number 1 if it weren't for these two songs, because often when I listen to this album, I skip those two and I go to Call Me Back Again as if those songs don't even exist, and no album deserving of a place in the top 3 will make you do that. And believe me when I tell you that everything else this album has to offer, from the production to the instrumentation to the performances, is incredibly well put together, and it definitely rivals the quality of an album like Band on the Run. So I'm leaving it at number 5, unfortunately, but my inner child would definitely put this album at number 1. Alright guys, get ready for number 4, because this is one of the Paul McCartney albums I enjoy the most. 1989, Flowers in the Dirt. I know that a lot of you probably want to kill me right now. I mean, Tug of War, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, and Venus and Mars below Flowers in the Dirt? Are you kidding me? But I mean, come on, this album is the perfect 80s Paul McCartney album. That's why every day when I wake up, I say thank you, Elvis Costello, for helping McCartney with this incredible album. Allow me to run you through some of the songs that you find in this album, like the intro, My Brave Face, the most Beatle-esque song McCartney ever did after he left the Beatles. You have a wonderful bass line, incredibly catchy performance by Paul McCartney, 80s-like production that fits into McCartney's songwriting. The problem you had in McCartney II, Pipes of Peace, Press to Play, you don't have it in this album because McCartney adapts his songwriting to this sort of production really well in this album. Another wonderful performance by Paul McCartney is found in the song You Want Her To, one of my favorite songs in the entire album. I love the guitars, I love the bass line, I love how Elvis, this is a duet with Elvis Costello, he offers a contrast to McCartney's melodic singing that feels really similar to the typical Lennon-McCartney duo back in the Beatle days, which is one of the reasons why I like this song so much. Then it just kind of disappears into this jazz tune. I think it was Richard Niles who arranged the last part of the song. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but yeah, such a dynamic and fun song, represents his incredible chemistry with Elvis Costello, and I think that proves, if anything, that he was a key part of this album. I've said it multiple times throughout this video that that Paul McCartney always has an acoustic moment, a quiet, relaxing moment in each album that's often really, really good. And this album is not only good, but my favorite moment in the entire thing, because Distractions is one of the most beautiful, romantic, and seductive songs that Paul McCartney ever wrote. It sounds amazing with those flutes, what I think are flutes, playing in the background that add this ambient to the song that makes you feel like the song has this aroma to a freshly lit candle. Put It There has one of the most beautiful melodies that McCartney ever wrote, and his guitar playing reminds me of his songs in the White Album like Blackbird and Mother Nature's Son. Just like it happened in Tug of War, sometimes the 80s influenced McCartney's songwriting a little bit too much, and that results in songs like this one or The Day Is Done, not my favorite moments in the album, to be honest. But even the weaker moments in this album are incredibly enjoyable. The only reason why I don't like them is because I feel like they're too slow, too much echo, too syrupy. But for the most part, this album is incredibly entertaining. I love McCartney's chemistry with Costello, and I'm really happy that it made it so high up the list. I gotta be honest, I'm really scared about this one, so I'm just gonna get it out of the way. The bronze medal goes for 1973's Been on the Run. I'm sorry, dude. Please believe me when I tell you that I love this album. Some of my favorite Paul McCartney songs are found in this record, like Jet, Bluebird, Let Me Roll It, Mammonia, 1985. And if you want to say that this is the strongest track list in McCartney's entire discography, I would definitely agree with you. There's not a single bad song in this album. However, I feel like the albums that are above it meant more to me personally, and that's what made him go higher than Band on the Run. But believe me, I have a whole video on the channel talking about this. Band on the Run is McCartney's most successful album and probably his most important record too. I've explained the story of this album a couple of times already, but this was basically a do or die for McCartney. Rose Speedway, Wildlife, Ram, and McCartney 1 were not successful albums when it comes to critical acclaims, and considering the fact that John Lennon had Imagine and Plastic Ono Band, George Harrison had All Things Must Pass, some of the best albums of the 70s, McCartney needed to release an album that was both commercially successful and acclaimed by the critics, and that's exactly what Band on the Run is. And no wonder, you have the multi-faced epic that is the title track, you have the energetic euphoria of Jet, you have the relaxing acoustic seaside energy of the song Bluebird, the saxophone solo on Mr. Vanderbilt, the organs, the precise guitar playing, and McCartney's incredible performance in the song Let Me Roll It, my favorite song in the album, the afro soul-like rhythm and shiny guitars in the song Mammonia, the endearing lyrics of the song No Words, the emotional charge in the song Picasso's Last Words, and the little inclusions of melodies from other songs that make the album do a full circle. And of course, the fucking insane vocals and piano playing by McCartney in the song 1985. This album is a masterpiece. The only reason why it gets the bronze medal and not number 1, which it deserves, is because I have a personal connection, an emotional connection with the other albums that I have higher up the list. But objectively, man, I have to tell you this is definitely Paul McCartney's peak. The silver medal is a little difficult for me here because I have no idea how I'm going to explain that McCartney 1, released in 1970, is better than Band on the Run. I really have no arguments, half of the songs in this album are instrumentals and the other half sound like they were barely even finished. McCartney's performances in this album are really good, but they sound like they were recorded in a really amateurish and homemade way, which they were. Honestly, the only songs that sound like they were actually ready by the time this album was released is Maybe I'm Amazed, Junk, and Every Night. The rest of the songs in here, like Teddy Boy, for example, Man We Was Lonely, Ooh You, sound like they were only demos, they were somehow released in the final album. The drums have this weird silky texture that makes them lose a lot of their percussion power. The guitars sound sharp and dry, they don't really help the melodic nature of the album. So after all the negative things I said about this album, why is it at number 2? Why is it higher than an album that's so incredibly well put together as Band on the Run? Well, honestly, I have no idea, but it's undeniable that this album is one of my favorite albums of all time. And actually, if I had it my way, I would put this album at number 1 because this is by far the album I've heard the most when it comes to McCartney's solo discography. But even overall, when you take the entire history of music, this is one of the albums I've heard the most. The reason why, the only thing I can tell you is that this album is incredibly easy to listen to. There's no moment where you actually have to pay attention to what's happening in the instrumentation or with McCartney's performance. This is the closest thing an album has gotten to become like an old friend of mine. I've listened to thousands of albums, and to probably dozens of thousands of songs, but it gets to a point where you just want to listen to a nice tune, a nice melody. This album album feels like visiting your friend that knows how to play the guitar and he's just playing a couple tunes. You know, the acoustic in the room may not be the best. He is not necessarily playing the guitar as best as he possibly could, but there's this warmth, this comfort that exhales from this album that I think that makes this a really enjoyable experience for me every time I go back to it. The first time I heard this album, I was a little confused. I thought that I had the wrong version of the record. I thought that I bought like the demos, like a special edition with all the demos included. But when I realized that this was the actual album, that the album was not properly finished or crafted by McCartney, because he played every instrument, he produced every single song, and yes, he had experience producing songs with the Beatles, but it's more than obvious that by 1970, McCartney was not an expert when it comes to production. But again, this idea that McCartney's involved in every single one of the sounds of this album elevate the experience for me. And it's not like you don't have a bunch of beautiful tunes in this album as well. Memory Was Lonely, Every Night, Junk, one of the most beautiful songs he ever wrote. Ooh You, I really like that performance. I think that he adds a lot of power to those raspy vocals. And then of course, everyone's favorite McCartney song, Maybe I'm Amazed. And for anyone who wants to argue that I'm only convincing myself that this album is good, I don't agree at all. I mean, I've heard this album hundreds of times probably. I really do listen to this album that often. There's something in the homemade quality of the album that attracts me and that makes me feel at peace. And I think that's one of the main reasons why it's so high on the list. And finally, we're here with number 1. Let me tell you, I've been recording for a while. I've had 2 cups of coffee already. I am ready to end this video, but don't worry. I have more than enough energy to talk about this masterpiece of an album by Linda and Paul McCartney, 1971's Ram. One of the most important albums from the indie pop genre. Actually, a lot of people theorize that this was the first indie album ever made, which is definitely not true. But let me tell you, it fits the description because there's a multitude of genres and a multitude of styles scattered throughout the album. At moments, you have your typical rock and alternative rock tunes like Too Many People or Eat at Home, which is actually my favorite song in the album. Then you go to a more acoustic side of McCartney with Heart of the Country, and if you put a little psychedelia on top, you have Ram On, which has that whirlpool of sounds and harmonies towards the end of the song. Some of his pop influences also appeared on this album in the form of songs like Dear Boy and Uncle Albert, a song where he tries to replicate what he did with the Abbey Road medley by packing a bunch of songs together, creating one of his most popular and acclaimed songs. If you want McCartney to do a heavier rock sound, you're also going to be pleased with this album because of songs like Smile Away and Monkberry Moon Delight, which feature some of the most impressive vocals by Paul McCartney. His ability to add so much distortion to his voice and still sound so powerful is really impressive, and is by far one of my favorite moments in the album. If anyone ever comes to you saying that McCartney is not a great singer, show them Monkberry Moon Delight and watch them go silent. I also liked how much protagonism Linda enjoyed in many of the songs in this album, like Dear Boy, Admiral Halsey, Eat at Home, Long-Haired Lady. And I know that I said when I was talking about McCartney 1 that I would have loved to put that album at number 1, but I simply couldn't, because this album is so unique. It has so much variety. It's so special, and it's too big of a masterpiece to put it anywhere else but number 1. Because it doesn't really matter where else you look inside of McCartney's discography. Believe me when I tell you, you're not going to find a single song that sounds even remotely similar to anything off of Ram. So even though overall, in terms of enjoyability and quality, there's a few albums that in my opinion are slightly better than this one, the sheer uniqueness and how special this album is more than enough for me to put it at number 1. Because even though this man continues to reinvent himself and continues to try and do new things when it comes to music, for me, Paul McCartney was never as creative as he was in 1971 when he was writing and recording the songs for this wonderful album. I decided to put it number 1.
And this is the bit where I don't know the words, but I don't think I'm even gonna bother to try and learn them before the end of the tour.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be it for today's video. I really do hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. It took me a long time to make this video, so if you enjoyed, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your requests as soon as I can. I really do hope I can see you guys soon with a new video, but until then, bye.